Good morning, family. Good to see everybody. What I wanted to share this morning is something that touched my heart from Nehemiah. There's a statement which gets made a lot throughout the Old Testament where it talks about that the fathers of Israel hardened their hearts, it says, and they stiffened their necks. They had stiff necks. It's one of the things that the prophets criticize Israel the most with, that they have stiffened necks, which to me says they aren't able to hear. And the hard hearts, same thing, that they aren't able to receive that which God has to give them. And there was a phrase that struck me in Nehemiah chapter 9 that I wanted to share. It's right after, there's an amazing kind of revival that when they restore the Feast of Booths, which hadn't been practiced. In chapter 8 it says, since the time of Joshua. So through a major chunk of Israel's history, you think all the judges and David and Solomon and all the kings, and then the exile for 70 years. You get to the time of Nehemiah, it's after all that. They hadn't practiced this practice since Joshua. And there's a time of great revival, and then it says that the people confess their sin, and that's what chapter 9 is about. It's the people confessing their sin. And they're recounting some of the history of Israel, and they aren't making excuses for their sin. They're acknowledging it, confessing it. And one thing they say in chapter 9, verse 16, it says, but they are fathers. So it's talking about how good God has been. He's done all these amazing things. That's what the first part of chapter 9 is about. God did all these amazing things. He was faithful to the people. And it says, but they, our fathers, acted arrogantly in verse 16. They became stubborn and would not listen to your commandments. They refused to listen, and they did not remember your wondrous deeds which you had performed among them. So they became stubborn and appointed a leader to return to their slavery in Egypt. But you're a God of forgiveness, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness, and you did not forsake them. And the thing that struck me is, at the beginning, they became stubborn. It's the same phrase for having stiff necks, or it's kind of used interchangeably. But what struck me is the two ways they describe their stubbornness, the stubbornness of the leaders of Israel, are one, in verse 17, both of them are in verse 17. First is, they refused to listen. And second is, they did not remember your wondrous deeds. So it made me think that these are good things to consider. If I want to be soft of heart, and I want to be soft of neck, unstiff neck, whatever the word is for that. I want to really be receptive to the voice of God. And I see, here's a couple things I need to look out for. Not listening, refusing to listen to God's commands, and not remembering his wondrous deeds. And so refusing to listen, the first thing that struck me there is that refusing to listen isn't about hearing, it's about obeying. I was thinking, if Evie I have two children, as you all know, and if Evie's, hitting Zealand or something, I say, Evie, stop hitting. And she keeps hitting. I say, Evie, you're not listening to me. And she says, yes, I am. And she keeps hitting. I say, she's not listening. What does that mean? She can hear me. She's talking to me, but she's refusing to obey. A refusal to listen isn't not hearing. It's not obeying what I hear. It's not heeding what I hear. And so when they mention in Nehemiah here that their fathers refused to listen, it's demonstrated in hearing but not obeying. And it just made me think, are there things which I'm hearing from God but not obeying? Is there something that God has laid on my heart, but I'm saying, I don't know, maybe that's not the Lord? If so, I'm in danger of developing a stiff neck. I'm in danger of developing a hard heart. And I ought to take it really seriously if there are things which I'm hearing but not obeying. The second thing, the next part there is it says, they did not remember your wondrous deeds. And this is where I really want to focus, because, again, it's not about whether God's wondrous deeds exist somewhere in their minds. They knew all the good things that God did. The question is, remembering God's wondrous deeds is about calling them to mind in the moment it matters. When in the face of the next uncertainty, do I remember that God provided? When I face uncertainty, if I act like an orphan, it proves I don't know my Father. It reminds me of, when the disciples, right after Jesus fed the 5,000, Sandy just mentioned that. Jesus feeds the 5,000, and the next thing that happens is he comes out and walks on water. And the Bible, I think, I shared this a while ago. It says that they were terrified because they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves. And so I see there, they didn't remember his wondrous deeds. If they had remembered his wondrous deeds, they would have gained some insight from what he had done before. And proof that I don't remember God's wondrous deeds is not whether I can recall them, but when I face the next uncertainty, do I say, hey, God's provided before? Or do I panic again and think, oh no, I don't have a father. What's going to happen? I know what's going to happen. God's going to be faithful. And, it made me thinking about Evie and Zealand again. It's almost like, if around dinner time, Evie starts sobbing, crying, I say, what's wrong? She says, I'm hungry. I'm afraid I'm not going to get dinner. I say, hey, every single meal of your entire life I fed you. I know, but I'm just afraid. It's like, she doesn't remember. And the proof of her not remembering is when she faces her next hunger, she doesn't go, I don't have anything to worry about. She doesn't just come to me and say, Dad, I need help, trusting that I'm able to provide for her. And not remembering is demonstrated in encountering a situation without the confidence of God's proven power. And we can have full confidence. God's proven his power in our lives so many times. We can all testify to that. And so it's made me think, especially as it pertains to the second part of not remembering his wondrous deeds, how do we stir up our memories? How do we stir up our memories, so to speak, of God's wondrous deeds? How do we protect ourselves from not remembering his wondrous deeds and thus protect ourselves from having stiff necks and having hard hearts? And one thing that I was reminded, some of the brothers went camping this weekend. It was a wonderful blessing. And one thing I was reminded of is one way that we can stir up our memories is by meditating on his works and by telling each other stories of God's goodness and stories of what God's done for us. There's a part in Psalm 145. Psalm 145 is a wonderful psalm of praise. It's worth a lot of study, I think. But one thing that struck me in Psalm 145, there's a couple just sections I'll reference here. In verse 4, Psalm 145, verse 4, it says, one generation shall praise your works to another and shall declare your mighty acts. On the glorious splendor of your majesty and on your wonderful works I will meditate. Men shall speak of the power of your awesome acts, and I will tell of your greatness. They shall eagerly utter the memory of your abundant goodness and will shout joyfully of your righteousness. And then again down in verse 11, they shall speak of the glory of your kingdom and talk of your power, to make known to the sons of men your mighty acts and the glory of the majesty of your kingdom. And I see this as the beauty of our church meeting, and not just our church meeting, but also anytime that we fellowship with one another, when we're out camping, sitting around the campfire like we were a couple nights ago. As we come with an attitude of what he says here in verse 7, an attitude of eagerly uttering the memory of God's abundant goodness, we're protected from developing stiff necks and from developing hard hearts. And it says as much as in Hebrews. We all know this passage, but it says, it's in Hebrews 3. The point of this is I'm thankful for our church because I think it keeps me from having a stiff neck. It says in Hebrews 3, verse 12, take care, brethren, that there not be in any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God. How can we take care that we don't have an evil, unbelieving heart? But encourage one another day after day, as long as it is still called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. So how do we protect against that hard heart, that stiff neck? We encourage one another day after day. Our protection, this is the protection that comes hardening our hearts by the deceitfulness of sin. One thing that struck me as I was thinking about this is it's not just the listeners who are blessed and protected. It says, encourage one another so that you will not be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. He doesn't just say, be encouraged by one another. It's not a passive receiving, a passive listening. He doesn't say be encouraged by one another, implying only consumption, but rather encourage one another, which implies we both have roles to play. We both do both. We listen and we encourage. Everybody should seek to proclaim God's wondrous work in their lives. And not just to be encouraged, but also do some encouraging as well. And so going back to Psalm 145, it ends with a wonderful, wonderful promise given to those with this attitude of being eager to utter the memory of God's abundant goodness. It says in verse 18, the Lord is near to all those who call upon him, to all who call upon him in truth. He will fulfill the desire of those who fear him. He will hear their cry and will save them. The Lord keeps all who love him, but all the wicked he will destroy. The Lord keeps all who love him. It's an amazing verse. The Lord keeps all who love him. And in the context of this entire psalm, to me, it's clear that those who love him, when it says the Lord keeps those who love him are described at the beginning. They are those who praise his works to one another. They are those who declare his mighty acts, as it says in verse 4. There are those who meditate on his wondrous works, as it says in verse 5, who tell of his great goodness, who are eager to utter the memory of his abundant goodness to each other. And these are those who love him. These are those to whom the promise is made, the Lord keeps all who love him. And it's made me, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking, when's the last time, it says meditate on his wondrous works. When's the last time I meditated on the cross? There are lots of wondrous works. God's ultimate wondrous work in my life is the cross. When's the last time I've meditated on his goodness as poured out, his outpouring of love and suffering as a gift of love for me, and just meditated on it? It says that he loves those who praise his works to one another. When's the last time that I bragged on God? Where I came eagerly to a public meeting saying, I want to brag on what God's doing. God's doing amazing things. It says that those who love him are those who are eager to utter his memory. When's the last time I had a true eagerness to share something that God's been good to me and something that when I felt like I had something that I could not keep back? These are good questions to ask ourselves. This passage ends by saying that the Lord keeps those who love him. And I really want to be someone who the Lord keeps. Someone who's protected from having a stiff neck, protected from having a hard heart. And so I really want to take these reminders seriously.